I want to welcome all of you to this breakout session. Thank you very much for coming and spending your time with us tonight, especially for coming to this very important but sometimes difficult topic. So my name is Janice Bullock. I am an ambassador to the Utah Women in Leadership Project, but I'm not going to be speaking to you tonight. I'm going to introduce your first speaker, and then she's going to introduce the rest of her panel. So first, we're going to hear from Tiffany Turley. She's the Title IX coordinator at BYU. And so she's recently been kind of in the hot seat, and I'm going to let her talk about that and then introduce the rest of her panel.
So I'm totally not a stand behind the podium kind of speaker. I feel like I'm giving a talk at church, and that's not the audience. So I am a walker and a talker. Plus, I was telling my husband, I think that when I walk, some of my nervous energy comes out. So I'm probably going to be walking around and just talking. And I really hope, this is a small enough group here that I hope this can be kind of conversational. If you have questions, let's talk about it. That's what you're here for. That's what I'm here for. And I'm excited as well to have some other people in the audience. I was telling them before you all came in that it's actually intimidating for me to be given this presentation because any of them could do it and do a fabulous job, and they are definitely experts in the field. So in a minute, they're going to each get up and talk about the organizations that they work for, including the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, the Center for Women and Children in Crisis, and the Rape Recovery Center. 3 great organizations really impacting this work here in the state of Utah. So I'll turn some time over to them in a minute, but as Joanie said, my name is Tiffany Turley. I work at the BYU Title IX office. I oversee really all of the university's response to sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, sexual harassment, and stalking. So, no big deal of a job or anything like that, and not a job that anyone in this county is interested in, right? But it's a really important work, and I've been really pleased with all the changes that BYU has made over the past year and a half. We're heading in a great direction. We're really impacting this issue at our university, and I've been grateful as well for supporting organizations who I've worked with in the past, including all 3 that are represented here tonight, for the work that they do and how they've helped kind of train me up in this work. So first, we're going to be talking about sexual assault in Utah, and sometimes this can be a tricky thing to talk about because it's a very emotional topic. It's emotional for me. I'm not going to get into too much of my own story, but let's just say there's a reason why I do this work. It has personally touched my life, as I'm sure it has many of you or many of the people that you know and care about. It can be very emotional, and I find myself, that's actually probably why I don't talk about my own experience too much, because I do get really emotional, and heaven knows I'm already a little emotional right now with some other things going on in my life. So, but this is such an important issue, but nonetheless, it's a very direct issue, and I think unless we speak about it directly, unless we really understand it, then we can't do anything about it. I think it's an issue that far too long we've talked about and either kind of skirted around or not addressed head on, but that is not flying anymore, right? We all know about the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. This is not okay, and our society as a whole has taken a stand and said, this is not okay, and I'm really grateful for that. So we're going to start out because I think one of the best ways to impact something is to really know what it is. And so since we're in the state of Utah, I want to talk a little bit about the state of Utah, the law, the definitions, just so we're all kind of clear on what this is. Because I think sometimes it can be confusing. We hear sexual assault or sexual violence or rape, and what are we really talking about? So to start, let's talk about understanding the issue. So the state of Utah, gotta love the law, these are the definitions of sexual offenses in Utah. There's 14 of them, and they're a lot. And they're all pretty specific and very focused on a certain aspect of sexual assault, a certain act or behavior of sexual assault. But I think it could be a little bit confusing. So lest you think we're going to go into all 14 of these, we're not. There's a few that I think are really important to note. So basically define though, sexual assault is any sexual behavior or contact that occurs without the consent of the other person. So this is the most basic definition of sexual assault. Yes, there are the 14 definitions that we find in the law, but when it comes right down to it, each of them has this in common, that sexual assault is any behavior or action sexually that is against the consent of the other person. So important to keep in mind. So sexual assault definitions, there's a few that I think are really important that we do hear a lot more of. So those are rape, forcible sexual assault or fondling, and then sodomy. So those are three key aspects of both Utah law and what might be considered sexual assault, and then, things that we just hear people commonly referring to. So the first one is rape, or it can be attempted rape, and the definition from the law is sexual intercourse without the victim's consent. Now, a couple important things to know, because that can mean different things to different people. So it's important to know, first of all, rape can occur in marriage. I think this is something that far too often we don't talk about either. I think some people think that when they get married, the other person's body and physical is theirs to be had, and consent doesn't need to be there, but it absolutely does. Whether it's you're holding hands with someone on a first date, or you're engaged in intercourse in a marriage or another committed relationship, consent has to be there. That has to be talked about. It has to be something that we discuss and that we understand. So it's important to know, even if someone gets married, that doesn't mean that consent is out the window and one party can do whatever they want to the other. Penetration, when it talks about intercourse, that's of the genital or anal opening. And again, I know these aren't fun things to talk about. They're important. We understand this, though. So that's important to note. Also important to note that it can be however slight. So I think some people think if it's not full penetration, that's not rape. However slight the penetration is, it is considered rape. And a penetration can be of any part of the human body or an object. And both, if someone's found guilty of these in a court of law here in Utah, are first-degree felonies. So that's like the highest felony, the most serious crime that someone can commit is a first-degree felony. So it's really important to know that is what rape is. So we hear rape a lot and people don't quite understand, or people use it interchangeably with maybe other terms, but it's important to know exactly what the legal definition is, and then some of these other important points that I think are important to know as well. Any questions about that? Okay, so the next one is fondling or forcible sex abuse. So this is, again, I think another term that people just kind of use and maybe aren't quite sure what it means. So again, legal definition, the touching of the private body parts of another person without their consent for sexual gratification. So again, you're going to see a theme with these definitions we're talking about. The without consent is the big part, because that is the most important thing. And I think whether it's a prosecutor or a University Title IX office, or someone is looking at a situation and whether or not it was sexual assault, consent is the underlying theme. Was there consent or was there not? And with the law, of course, there are different levels of consent, say for teenagers. There's age differences and things that play into account, but generally consent is the most important thing, and consent is had when someone agrees to something or doesn't agree to something. So that is what fondling or forcible sex abuse is. Again, a couple important things to know. So first, that the private body parts include the genitals, anus, groin, breast, inner thigh, and buttocks. So this is just touching or anything besides penetration. Penetration would be what we talked about a minute earlier. So that would be forcible sex abuse. It can be an element of sexual assault and other forms of sexual assault. We typically refer to it as fondling or forcible sex abuse when it's just the only thing that occurred. So there wasn't penetration or the next thing that we're going to talk about. And then this is forcible sex abuse is also a felony in the state of Utah, so important to know. And then finally, sodomy. I think this is one that we don't talk about often, but in the state of Utah has a definition that I think is really important to know. So it is any sexual act involving the genitals of one person and the mouth or anus of another person. I think we often think of sodomy and the latter half of that definition, but not the former. So oral sex is a form of sodomy. So if someone forces someone to perform oral sex in the state of Utah, that is not rape, that is classified as sodomy. And then it can be committed, as all of these can, but I think in this definition it's important to note, by any gender against any gender. I think this is often thought of in the context of, maybe gay men commit sodomy, but it really can be any gender against any gender. And in the state of Utah, they will charge a female with sodomy against a man if that woman made that man perform oral sex on her or she did it to him. So really important to know, that's what sodomy is. And it is a Class B misdemeanor. If someone is found guilty of that, maybe there's an age of consent, an age issue. But if it's found to be forcible sodomy, which is without consent, then it's a felony. So So those are the definitions. And again, I know that these aren't fun things to talk about, but I think until we really understand what sexual assault is and even some of the verbiage that we're using, it can be really hard to make a difference with this issue. So a couple of things as I've been thinking about what we should talk about more and how we can make a difference. We get this question a lot. Is it sexual violence? Is it sexual assault? Is it rape? How should I refer to it? And honestly, it kind of depends on the situation because all three can be applicable. So when you're talking about criminal acts or something in a court of law, then obviously the definitions that we just referred to are really important because they're going to play a role in how prosecutors look at the crime, how law enforcement looks at the crime. But generally, if you're talking about this issue, sexual violence is a pretty good general term that you can use to kind of capture all of it. So it's not really a right or wrong thing. I think sometimes if we focus specifically on rape, it minimizes the other offenses that we've talked about, because rape is a very specific form of sexual violence, one that happens much too often. But there's, as you saw, many different forms and many ways that someone can sexually assault someone. And by just focusing on rape, it kind of takes that away. So as people who work in this community, we often refer to sexual violence as kind of the general term when we're talking about this issue. Another thing that is important to note is we often have people ask, should I use the term victim or should I use the term survivor when talking about this issue? And, because in the media and, with what people prefer to be called and all of that, it can be tricky to know. And we've heard both. And honestly, both terms are applicable, but maybe in different ways. So someone who is when we use the term victim, it's often referring to someone who has been affected by sexual violence, and there might be a criminal side to it. So the prosecutors, law enforcement, they're always going to use the word victim because that is the terminology associated with the law and with criminal justice system. So someone who's going through that process or involved in that process, that's often the term that is used. For survivors, it's usually someone who's either gone through the healing process or when we're discussing kind of the long-term effects of sexual violence, we often use the term survivors. And honestly, the best way to know how someone wants to talk about this, say someone comes to you, and we'll talk in a minute about if someone comes to you, how you can respond and what you can say and what you can do to help them. But the best way to know is simply, as with so many other things, ask, right? If someone comes to you, we'll talk about a response, but asking them, would you rather me refer to as a victim or a survivor? What sounds better to you? What feels better? And then they'll let you know, and then there's no question. So either can be applicable. Some people, for me, I use them interchangeably depending on the setting. I'm fine being referred to as either, as someone who has gone through this. So it's just important to know, the best way to know is to ask. And then date rape or rape. We often hear people say, is date rape a thing? Like, what is the difference between date rape and rape? And my response is always, don't use the term date rape or acquaintance rape. Somehow I think in our minds, I don't know if it makes us feel a little bit better, like those are maybe less scary because someone didn't jump out of a bush or attack someone, randomly. And I think by using the terms date rape and acquaintance rape, we mitigate the impact of that crime because we're almost implying like, oh, it's someone you knew, so surely it couldn't have been that bad. When really, we know that 80 to 90% of these crimes are committed by someone that the person knows. And I think in most cases that actually can be more damaging because when you think about sexual assault, if you're walking down the street and someone jumps out of a bush, then you know you can't trust strangers, right? We're taught that from a very young age. Don't trust strangers, don't talk to strangers, whatever. But when it's someone sitting next to you who you are either a friend with or you're acquainted with in some way or you know from school or they're a coworker and that person attacked you, someone you thought you could trust, then your level of trust in the world generally is kind of shattered. And so I think when we qualify these two things as, oh, it was rape or it was date rape, it mitigates the impact that the one has. And it's important to know that rape is rape regardless of who committed the crime. It has the same kinds of impacts. And like I said, sometimes even more serious when it is someone you know, which in most cases is what happens. Okay, so now talking about sexual assault in Utah, that's why we're here, right? So I want to talk a little bit about some of the statistics and the numbers associated with sexual assault. So in the United States on a whole, nearly 1 in 2 women will experience some form of sexual violence in her lifetime. Now, what do you think Utah's rate is? And I know the answer, so I'm really looking to you.
I would say it's the same.
In Utah, it's pretty much the same. Yeah. And again, you'll notice kind of what we were talking about before, right? There are different definitions for sexual violence and sexual assault and rape. But generally in the state of Utah, 1 in 2 women will face some form of sexual violence in her lifetime. Now, if you look around the room and you count off every other woman, that's a little harrowing, right? I mean, it can be scary. And honestly, as we think about it, as I mentioned, there's a reason I do this work. There's a reason that I got involved in this is because it affected me. But even if it didn't, I know in my own life, every other woman, or at least every few women, it's impacting. I don't think there's anyone in this world who doesn't have someone in their lives who has not been affected by sexual violence, whether you know that or not. I think everyone, this impacts all of us, and so it's really important that we talk about it. Now, in Utah, so again, going by kind of these different definitions, 1 in 3 women has been sexually assaulted, and 1 in 6 has faced rape, which again we talked about is the forced penetration, again, however slight. So these numbers, even when we take it a little bit further and a little bit deeper, rape is, they say the most serious sexual offense, right? Actual penetration, 1 in 6. Again, kind of looking around this room and thinking about the people in your lives, in your family, in your social circles, in your classes, 1 of 6 women will face rape, and 1 in 3 will face some form of sexual assault, and 1 in 2 will face some form of sexual violence. These numbers are real, and they can be scary. And statistics, I think statistics can paint any picture, and sometimes it's easy to kind of look at them and think, oh, it's just a number on a presentation. But it really is important to think about your own life and wonder, and I think once we start to do that, that's when we really can take a look and figure out how can we make a difference, knowing that whether this is affecting us personally or not, it's likely affecting someone that we know and love and care about. Yes?
When it says reports, does that mean reports to the police or just is talking about?
That's a great question. We're going to talk about reporting. So these statistics come from a survey of women in Utah. So not reports to the police, just women who responded to the survey. It was a pretty significant survey done in the state of Utah back in 2007. Unfortunately, I don't think it's been updated since, but it's got really great data, really good information, and so it's just generally women who reported, but maybe not to law enforcement. So for the purposes of this survey. So Utah and the nation, how do you think we compare? Our statistics are about the same, but generally, do you think our rate is lower than most states? I mean, we're like the average, but do you think higher? Okay, so Utah, it does occur at a higher rate than the national average. And in fact, it is the only violent crime in the state of Utah that occurs at a higher rate than the national average. So other violent crimes, homicide, robbery, things like that, occur in Utah at significantly lower rates than in the rest of the nation, but sexual assault and rape occur at a much higher rate than the rest of the nation. And it's been that way for the past 25 years. So I think sometimes it can be nice to think, oh, we live in Utah, it's a very safe place, we have strong communities here, but to think that it's not happening here is such a bad thing to think, because it does happen here, and in fact it's happening at much higher rates than in other places in our country. So important to note, and again, that's been the case for at least the last couple decades. So what about men? I realize that here we are tonight talking about sexual assault, and it's for the Utah Women in Leadership Project, right? And the focus is on, and often when we talk about these situations, on women as victims of sexual assault, because we know that most often that's the case. Gender normative terms have women as victims and men as perpetrators. That is typically the case that we see. But I think we would all agree that we'd be remiss if we didn't also recognize that this impacts men as well, and in very different ways. I think men are often shamed more from coming forward and talking about it than women are, for a variety of reasons. Socialization, culture, things. Men should be stronger. They should be able to fight them off. Is he gay if he was raped by another man? There's so many reasons that men don't come forward, and I think that's something that as a society we need to work on as well, in ensuring that men have the same access to support and resources that we're making sure and trying to ensure that female victims do. But at least 1 in 6 men, which is what the graphic is, will be sexually abused at some point in their lifetime. Again, kind of a harrowing statistic. And sexual assault for men and women, it does look a little bit different, but generally the impacts and the outcomes are the same. And so it's important that while we're talking about this issue, we don't neglect the fact that men are also, can be victims of sexual violence. There's this quote that I love. There's a group called the 1 in 6 organization, which is focused on male sexual assault victims. And this is a quote that they share on their website. Conventional wisdom about sexual abuse limits and distorts people's understanding about men's needs, safety, and vulnerability when they've had an abusive sexual experience. So it is important to know that while a lot of these statistics that I mentioned, 1 in 2 women, 1 in 3 women, things like that, yes, that's where a lot of our data is, but it would be an awful thing if we just assume this impacted women. It impacts men as well. And so as we're talking about how to get involved and what you can do and the work that some of these organizations do, it's important to remember that as well, that men can be victims as well. So maybe you don't know 1 in 2 women who's been assaulted, but maybe you know the 1 in 6 men. Okay, so reporting statistics. This is, yes, please.
Are you going to talk about why it's higher in Utah than it is in other parts? That's something we're going to discuss.
You know, it's not something that I have planned to discuss, and honestly, I don't necessarily know the reason. I don't know that there's a documented reason. Do any of the 3 of you have I mean, I probably have some thoughts on that. I don't know. Do you have a thought?
So there's no documented study that can currently give us a direct answer, but there's a lot of conversation within the anti-violence movement here in our community. When you think about the vulnerability component of sexual violence, the dynamics that exist is that there's power that is stripped away from the survivor. And so what we look at is the demographics in our community. The highest rate of sexual violence that is reported is child sexual abuse. So I want you to consider going into a restaurant and you see a family come in and you see 7 little heads bopping behind mommy and daddy. Access to children is easy in our community. The way that we groom, the way that we socialize, the way that we raise our young girls to be in some way submissive, to not know their voice, to not stand in their ground, to not take up space, to question their power. So there's that aspect. Then there's also a component of living in a conservative community where the conversation is oftentimes masked in a stigma of shame. So survivors are not empowered to disclose. Survivors are not given the opportunity to come forth. Prevention, which is something that I will be talking about here in just a moment, is also a critical gap that must be filled. That need must be met. And yet, we still have certain policies and practices in our schools that bind our hands in terms of what we can teach regarding consent and safe and consensual sexuality. So there's a lot of reasons, but I also want to be cautious that we don't mask this as something that is because of the conservative faith in our community, because we can have this conversation down south in the Bible Belt as well. Whenever we exist in communities where this conversation is limited, where people are not given access to forums to speak openly about this, we will have higher rates of sexual violence.
Thank you. Yeah, so I don't know that there's documented reasons. There are a lot of reasons, like she mentioned, that would lead us to understand more as to why. And speaking of reporting, it's really interesting because we have that survey, right, that shows that 1 in 3 women face sexual violence and 1 in 6 women will face rape in the state of Utah. But our reporting statistics, so the nation is about 1/3 of victims report to law enforcement. What do we think Utah's is? Do you think we report more or less than 34%? How about 11.8%? Report to law enforcement. And as Nubia said, I mean, there are a lot of reasons for this, none that are necessarily documented in an awesome study that we can wrap up and talk about, but there's a lot. This has been not talked about. I think in every training I go to, inevitably someone will come up to me, I've never talked to anyone about this before, but I want to talk to you about this. What can I do? Or where can I get help? And that always breaks my heart a little bit when I hear someone say, I've never spoken to anyone about this before, because that means they've been suffering in silence, and that is what needs to end. Yes?
Do you think one of the reasons, and I'm not saying it is, because I
Yeah.
don't know, is because it's a family member?
I think that's, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be one of the contributing reasons. Maybe not the only reason, but absolutely a contributing reason, because we know, as we talked about, 80 to 90% of these are committed by someone the person knows, and this impacts children, which we'll talk about also. And in most cases with children, it is a family member. So, yes.
sexual violence happening in your home, it is your absolute duty as husband or wife to report that. And we will follow the extent of the law. And we have done it, and we will do it. And it is your religious duty. And that was a really great message to hear. It was kind of the first time maybe that I heard that in my lifetime, but I thought that was great.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think one thing too is there's often this confusion between, law enforcement and crimes, and then maybe what's disclosed in an ecclesiastical setting or a church setting, and the lines can get blurred as far as what needs to be done and how it should be handled. And I think as a society, not just here in the state of Utah, but generally in the country, people are talking about this more, and it's leading more people to think, how would I handle that? How should I handle that? And people are handling it in different ways, which hopefully will put us on the right path to making a difference, letting more people feel comfortable coming forward and talking. I think that the Me Too movement has given victims a voice and allowed them the opportunity to come forward and talk about this, because so many people who maybe haven't been affected by sexual violence as victims are willing to also stand up and say, wait a minute, yeah, that's not right. And so victims realize they're not alone. Everyone around them, well, it should be everyone, recognizes that these things aren't okay. And so I think that those conversations are picking up, hopefully more, in settings where we can really make a difference, like a church setting or school settings or settings like this, where people are talking about it and really wanting to make an impact. So, false reporting, how often do we think that happens? Because that is something, especially as a Title IX officer at a university, I often hear, what if someone false reports this? What if it's not true? What if I'm falsely accused of something? Which can happen, and there are instances where that has happened. But generally, what do you think the rate is of someone falsely reporting a sexual assault? And again, I know the answer, so I'm asking all of you. Say again? It's between 2 and 10. And what's interesting about that is when you look at the false reporting of any other crime, so my car got broken into, someone robbed my house, any other crime, these numbers are in line. So sexual assault is not any more falsely reported than someone walking to the police station and saying, my car got stolen. These numbers are so low. Again, there are instances where it's happened, but generally that is not the case. Plus, as someone who does this work, I honestly can't think of anyone who would want to go through the process of reporting and identifying themselves as a victim and talking about this and a potential, criminal investigation or sexual assault exam in the hospital who didn't actually go through it. Those are, unfortunately, I think another piece of our puzzle that we need to work on, but those can be very hideous and trying circumstances that make the situation even more difficult. So for someone to go through that and come forward and talk about it, chances are, and studies show, that they're telling the truth, and we need to listen to what they're saying. Okay, so a few more statistics to note, and I want to keep in mind too, with the Me Too movement and a lot of the things that have come out in social media, there's been a heavy focus on sexual harassment, which is a different thing than sexual violence and sexual assault that we're talking about tonight. But in each of your chairs, there's a handout on sexual harassment in Utah. So if you want to learn more about that, it's a little bit of a different topic, so I figured we'd give you that handout as well so you have that information. The Utah Women in Leadership Project also has a sexual assault research brief that kind of looks like the one that you have, that talks more about sexual assault and where a lot of these statistics come from. But sexual harassment, I don't want to overlook that, because I know that's been a big topic as well, and also something that we need to talk about. Honestly, I think any of us could sit up here and talk about this for like 5 hours, but we don't have that time. So the written information should be helpful when it comes to sexual harassment, and we'll briefly talk through some more aspects of sexual assault that are important to note. So we talked about this. Most sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows. Weapons are rarely used in sexual assault, as far as like a gun or a knife. They are used sometimes, but not often. Usually it's body force, like physical strength and physical violence, or manipulation, coercion, threats, things like that. That's usually how a perpetrator can overpower a victim. Weapons, I think people think of sexual assault as someone's got a knife at their neck or a gun at their back, and they force them to do something they don't want. But in most cases, weapons are not used. Nonetheless, in a lot of cases, about a third, between a quarter and a third, victims do face some form of physical injury as a result of of the sexual violence. So even if weapons aren't used, there's still an outcome of violence, which is why sexual assault is also a medical issue and something we need to be thinking about when it comes to healthcare in the medical community. Childhood impacts, as Nubia mentioned, a great number of the victims, unfortunately, especially here in the state of Utah, who are victims of sexual assault and sexual violence are children. And over 3/4 of the victims of sexual violence in Utah, so about 80%, 78.7%, state that they were abused before they were age 18, and about 1/3 of those indicate that it happened before they were 10. So, I mean, it's just, it makes me a little bit sick to my stomach, especially thinking of bringing a new little baby boy into this world. It can be scary to think about these things, but that is why we are all here. That is why we are talking about this, because by talking about this and by all of us sharing our information with you and our perspectives and ways to get involved, then you can take that information and go out into the world and do good with it, and we can start to lower these numbers, because this one, I think, is probably the most harrowing slide that we have, because it's just heartbreaking to think about these things happening to children, and yet that is often something that we see. Okay, so the cost of sexual assault in Utah, by the number, it costs Utah annually about $5 billion to address sexual assault in Utah and navigate the impacts that it has. Typically, the impacts come from the loss of quality of life of the victims. And so these issues, not only are they making a difference and taking a toll on society emotionally, but also financially. And it's really important that we keep that in mind. There are actual fiscal impacts to this issue here in the state of Utah. Interestingly enough, in the state of Utah, in 2011, the government spent $92 million on people who were found to have committed sexual assault or sexual violence, but only $16.5 million on helping victims. And I think that's really important to know, because it shows that maybe we need to even the scales a little bit. I think that as advocates, and I think my colleagues here would agree, that one of the best ways that we can lower these numbers is by preventing it in the first place. The analogy I always use is, do we want to be the fence at the top of the cliff, or do we want to be the ambulance down at the bottom, right? Like, do we want to prevent this, or do we want to respond to it? Bottom line is, quite frankly, we need both. But I think some of the best advocacy work we can do is in the prevention of it in the first place, whether that's rehabilitating sex offenders or putting more money into education, whatever it might be. We have to even these scales, and we have to do as much prevention as we are responding. And these numbers show that we're really focusing a lot more heavily on one side than the other, and that's important to note. Yes?
I was just wondering, where are they at with all the rape cases that they haven't even taken care of forever?
Like the sexual assault kits? Well, a bill has been passed now through the legislature that says all sexual assault kits have to go to the state crime lab. Obviously, they're a little bit behind given the backlog, but a law has been passed now that says there's no question if a sexual assault examiner does a kit, it goes to the crime lab for testing. So definitely headed in the right direction, but understandably will take them a little while to get caught up. But it is law now that happens. So good news on that front. Okay, so making an impact, as I said, I have 3 amazing colleagues here who are going to talk a little bit about the work that they do and the organizations here in Utah that are actually working to make a difference in this issue, and who I know in my life, as someone who's invested in this and someone who's been through it, these organizations are doing such great work. So with that, I'm going to start with Soraya Collard, who works at the Center for Women and Children in Crisis as a sexual assault therapist, and then we will go to Nubia Pena, who works at the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and then Megan Asadian, who works at the Rape Recovery Center. So with that, Soraya, I'll hand the mic off to you.
Okay, so I brought some information for y'all if you want some. Because we are the agency that provides services for people here in Utah County, so I do have plenty of pamphlets for you if you guys are interested in those. And I will be using one for my cheat sheet. But I want to thank Tiffany for so far for the presentation. She mentioned her concern about presenting in front of us, but I think you did such a fantastic job. I've been involved in this movement for about 4 years on this impact, or in this capacity, not as a therapist, but I've worked with the center for a few years. And you know, 4 years ago, we wouldn't have had this big of a crowd. So to me, I appreciate where we're going, and I appreciate you all being here. This really does warm my heart. And as mentioned, I am a therapist, and it's been a long day, so I might cry. So just so you know. But that's because I have a great job. I love my job. I'm single and trying to date by being, sexual assault therapist. People look at me like, okay, how do we step away further? But I love my job. And when I describe what I do to people, when I tell people what I do, male, female, they all, okay, that's okay. Kind of try to step back, but which is a little frustrating from time to time. But I want to say the reason why I love my job is because I get those moments. I get to see the moments when people say, oh, it's not my fault. And that's a beautiful moment. And I get to see the moments when they say, I did the best that I could. I get to see the moments when they get to feel this voice, and they get their voice, and they get to say these things that are super empowering, and that I love. And I love my job. I started off at the center as the rape crisis coordinator. So just so you know, a few of the things that we do have, we have a rape crisis team, and we actually have in this room 2 volunteers. So can I have you guys stand up? And we've got one on call right now, so I'll describe to you what they do when they're on call. So these are our volunteers. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves? I know.
We didn't know we were going to be doing this. This is a surprise. I'm Amber Shorts, and I've been on the rape crisis team for about a year now. And I'm on call, the brick phone. So if I hear a ring, it might put me into panic. So hopefully everyone's phones are off.
I'm Chelsea Wood, and I've been on the rape crisis team for a year or 2. We trained together, actually. So.
Okay, thanks. I just want to point out these, I know that I was going to say that they're just here, but I want you to see that there are people in our community who don't work for our center, but who work for us as a community, who are here, who volunteer their time. They take 48-hour shifts, at least one 48-hour shift a month, but some of these people take a lot more than that. And they respond to calls all hours of the day. And so that's going to the hospital, or that's taking crisis calls where they speak to some of my clients. I refer my clients as anytime you need to talk to somebody, call the hotline. So we appreciate what they do, and they do that not just for our center, but for our whole community. So I appreciate what you guys do. So just really quickly about our services, we, Center for Women and Children in Crisis, we have there's 2 legs of what we do. We have the domestic violence shelter, so just a few things about what we offer. A safe, confidential location, 30-day stay at the shelter, advocacy, safety planning, individual and group therapy, parenting classes, daily life classes, or life skills classes, aftercare program, and transitional housing. So that's all that we have. This is in here. And then as far as the services that we provide for survivors of sexual assault, we have the rape crisis team, as I mentioned. The rape crisis team, like I said, they respond to hospital calls. So when people are getting the CODAR exam, they respond to that hospital call. And then they take the hotline calls during all hours of the day. And then we have a Wednesday night class that is for primary and secondary victims of sexual assault. So secondaries, that would be partners, family, friends, parents, anybody who's been impacted by somebody who has experienced by this, and who are supporting them and helping them. And so we have a class on Wednesday for primary and secondaries. We also have a class on Tuesday nights that is specifically for secondary survivors, and we go over how to support. We talk about going through the criminal justice system. We talk about if they didn't report, how to support for that. We talk about holidays, different things like that. We also talk about the secondaries' possible PTSD symptoms, because it definitely impacts them as well. And then we have individual and group therapy. So in the group therapy, the therapists who run that group, they've been doing this for over 20 years, and they're really good. They know what they're doing, and we call it the room that we hold the group therapy. We call it the sacred room, and we don't go in there except for group therapy, because it is where a lot of amazing things happen on the road to recovery. So those are some of our services that we provide. Like I said, I do have this. And once again, I do just want to thank you guys for being here, joining your voice to this movement, because that's what it is. The movement started way long ago. It wasn't just the Me Too campaign, but I so appreciate what that's done. But this is a movement that started long ago, and I appreciate you guys adding your voices by being here. By being here, you're speaking to at least some survivor here, saying, you matter, you're important. And I appreciate that you being here is speaking that. So thank you so much for what you're doing by being here and taking the time to come and to hear those statistics. Sometimes I haven't gone through those statistics in that way for a long time. It's not my capacity to do that anymore. Like I said, I'm out the other end that gets to hear, oh, it's not my fault. So it is heavy, it is tough, but it's important that we speak about these things, and it's important that you're here, and it's important that you, like I said, you're speaking to somebody saying you're important, and I'm glad you're here. So thank you for what you guys are doing.
Thank you so much. All right. I also want to start off by just giving kudos to Tiffany. You did a brilliant job. You made us very proud, and congratulations on the baby bump. So, all right. My name is Nubia Pena, as recently stated, and I work with the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I am the longest standing member of the coalition. I've been in this movement for over a decade. I have to tell you that coming into this space and recognizing that there were several options that you could have chosen to be in tonight. You could have listened on other topics, but you specifically selected us. So thank you so much for coming and sharing this space. I want to be able to briefly tell you about the coalition, what we do, how we serve Utah and our community, but I also want to make sure that I leave time for some questions. You obviously selected us for a reason, so there might be things on your heart that are pressing that you want to be able to have a little bit more direction on. But on the Coalition Against Sexual Assault, my capacity there is the training and prevention specialist. What I tend to do is I go into the community, I assist during our 40-hour training. We certify all of the advocates that work frontline with survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, those who are dealing specifically with sexual assault victims. We are offering that training. It is free. Please visit our website if you are interested in being certified to actually receive a training of 40 hours. We host it throughout different regions and areas, so if there is one that's upcoming here in Utah County, we invite you to join. That would give you the opportunity to volunteer with the Women's Resource Center, with the Women's Crisis Center, with BYU, Title IX office, as well as potentially going into law enforcement as a victim advocate. So prior to working at the coalition, I also served as a domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking victim advocate with law enforcement at Unified Police Department. So some of the work that I now do is training and building capacities with those involved in ending sexual violence in our community. It is critical for us to be able to have an understanding of what is happening, not only locally, not only nationally, but within our own organizations. If you're a teacher, if you're a student, if you're an educator, if you are a professional in any capacity, do you know your policies that protect you? Do you know the laws that empower you to disclose? Do you know what is currently written in the books that say you have the right to exist free of violence? Do you know what laws you stand on? And if you don't, I recently created a curriculum to teach community partners, members, and business owners on sexual harassment policies, because you have to understand that although this is happening, there were laws that were put in place to make sure that it didn't. And so what is currently happening as being justified is because as a society, we are saying that this is okay, and enough is enough. And that's what this community space is doing. We are saying no longer will we tolerate a space space where a survivor feels like they must live in the shadows. No longer will we tolerate a space where there is a person that can walk away freely and think that this is something they can do again and again and again. Because when we were talking about the statistics of how often this happens, let's also talk about the statistics of how often people are held accountable. In Salt Lake County, there were only 2% of cases that came before that were prosecuted, of all of the cases that were reported. Okay? I should also tell you that aside from being in this capacity at the coalition, I'm also a juvenile defender. So I work on the opposite side, and I also see the stories of the perpetrators of sexual violence who are coming in, who are minors. And there's a lot of misunderstanding around what is sexual violence. And these children find themselves in these situations, and it's complicated, and it's difficult, and they're stigmatized, both the victim and the offender, who are just children. We have a responsibility to our next generation to be able to know what we can do to prevent this. Because as we were being given the numbers of how much is going into intervention and how much is going into offender rehabilitation, only 5% of that money goes into prevention. 5%. So as Tiffany stated, we are that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. We are the people that are consistently and readily taking individuals, stitching them up. The problem is that what we are doing is we are putting Band-Aids on gashing wounds, and we need surgery. Okay, so some of the work that the Coalition Against Sexual Assault does, besides giving training and building capacity, we are also incredibly active at the legislative session right now. My executive director, Turner Benton, he was supposed to be here this evening, but he has been active on the Hill trying to bring about political change, right? Making sure that our survivors have representation in the laws that are going to promote safety, promote justice. So I encourage you, if you are more interested in that and what are current bills that we are advocating for, please visit our website. There is an entire section where you can look at all of the bills that are being heard right now, and we encourage you to contact your local representatives. Tell them, this is a bill I support, this is a bill that matters, and let me tell you why, okay? The other thing that we do in the prevention field is that I bring a lot of prevention activities to at-risk youth. So I do a lot of work with individuals in the detention centers, a lot of our young girls. A lot of the work as a juvenile defender is now intersecting with the work that we talk about here, because many of these children are victims and survivors of trauma, and their delinquency is being mislabeled. They're survivors, they're victims, and everything that they are doing is a cry for help, and no one is asking the right questions. So I need us as a community to rally, to redefine justice, because currently justice is not being served, not to the individuals that are desperately saying, I need you to be my voice. So I'm looking around the room right now, and again, I'm seeing you actively engaged, and thank you so much for being present, because this is a hard conversation. So if at any point tonight you have been triggered or something has caused you pain from something you had pushed down from a very long time ago, I encourage you to please be able to reach out to our therapist, to connect with Tiffany, to pull me aside, and please make sure that your voice is heard, but that you also practice self-care. Now, one of the things that I find incredibly necessary in our community, especially because of, again, what I mentioned, the conservative nature that we tend to have around this conversation, is for us to encourage each other that we have to be able to speak about consent, about sexuality, beyond morality. Because whether you like it or not, children and our young adolescents and our young populations in college age, especially because we're here at UVU, in our high schools, in our elementaries, they will be exposed to content. And it is preferred that they understand it through the lens of consent, of empowerment, of permission, and of safety, than of them being led by individuals that don't know any better. Okay, so at this point, I do want to open it up to you and just ask you, is there something on your heart, on your mind that you want to understand more of? Why did you choose this session? Or what would you like to know that maybe I can answer or one of our panelists can answer for you? Yes?
I had a question about consent. As far as I understand, consent can't be given, like children can't give consent, teenagers can't give consent. The age of consent is 18, is that correct?
No, and it's super complicated. Wow, way to go ahead and start me off with that one. Okay. So the age of consent, any child under the age of 14 cannot by law consent to any sexual activity. Above that, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And so this is partly when we're in schools and we're educating on this issue, we really want to focus on power dynamics. And we want to talk to children about the fact that the law is very clear. If you're under the age of 14, it doesn't matter that you were excited and you wanted to and you felt comfortable and you felt empowered in that moment. The law is very clear. You cannot give consent to engage in any sexual activity. But when you start into the 15 and 16, there is some consent that is allowed. But then you talk about the age of consent, which then makes it even more complicated if the person is above the age of 18, right? And so this is partly why I always encourage people to visit our website. We have something that is called Age of Consent Laws. It's a one-page that you can download, and I encourage you to review it. Because if you're working within this population, they want to know, what line can I cross, right? What can I get away with? What can I not? And so I want us to be able to have dialogues, more importantly, more than just what can I do, but what is healthy? What is age appropriate? Because currently the way that we look at culture, the way that society, the media, pop culture talks about sexuality, it is normalized for these children. And this is going to sound very crass, but unfortunately, I am daily dealing with young girls that believe that their value lies between their legs. And again, very crass, and I'm sorry about that. But everything that is telling them that they value is about their beauty, their appearance, what they give, not what is internally, something that they can provide. Their divine worth has completely been erased, right? Don't start me preaching, y'all. I'm sorry, but I will, okay? And so, but what I want us to consider is that there are no forums for these dialogues. There are no ways that we can engage individuals to say, look at what you just watched in these popular television shows that are teaching you about what is healthy femininity and what is healthy masculinity and what is healthy for non-gender conforming. Because I have to make sure that there is space in this room for people that are also marginalized, right? That are never listened to in terms of their voice, their story, and their survivorship. This is a complicated and very emotionally taxing issue. Why? Because we haven't provided space where people can feel empowered by the time that they're done. And that's what we are hoping to create. So as it relates to consent, it's complicated, but the age of consent where no one can give consent, 14 and below. Okay, excellent. What else? Yes.
I do have a question, and I can talk openly about it because I feel like I've already gone through my healing process, so I feel like I went from a victim to a survivor.
Excellent, thank you.
As a child, I experienced sexual abuse for like a year when I was about 7 years old. Now, I think Tiffany I mentioned that a lot of victims don't say anything. So I didn't say anything until I was about 16 or 17 years old. But by the time I said something that we told the authorities, it was somebody in my family, we went to the authorities. They kind of didn't care about it because it was too late. So he got away with it, and they didn't care about following, about doing any reports or doing anything about it. What is the time frame where they have? Because I'd hate for anybody else or a child to go through this because of that shame period that they go through and there's no healing between that time. To not say anything until they're older and then nothing to be done because it's too late according to the authorities. So is there a time frame?
The statute of limitations actually has changed, and I want to make sure that I give you the exact information, so I will look that up right now, but it has recently changed. And I'll give you an example where I have a case right now. One of my clients, they are 20 years old, but the incident occurred when they were 11. So even though several years have already passed, but the child that was victimized is now coming forward, and that individual is now having to come to court, even though many years have changed. But what you're also talking to me about is a cultural shift that needs to happen in the way that our law enforcement responds to survivors. No one should have ever made you feel that your story, regardless of how long you waited to disclose, because we know that there's a reason for that wait to have happened, no one should have ever made you feel like that story didn't matter. So I'm sorry for that. But that's also partly why we have advocates and we have therapists, because sometimes
sometimes justice will not come in the form of the criminal justice system. And we have to be able to become very creative in the way that we find healing and empowerment, and the way that we can involve ourselves in this movement and see growth in our own progress. So I do hope that there has been some healing for you. Thank you for your bravery and your courage in being able to disclose in this space, but I will make sure that I get you that information here in just a moment, okay? Thank you. Go ahead. Yes, excellent, thank you. So at this point, thank you all so much for giving me that space to engage and to connect and to introduce myself and our coalition. I do want to briefly just mention that there is now a mobile app that we have launched. It is the first that has been created, but at Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, you can download the You Are a Survivor app, and it will give you all of the information about where can you find a victim advocate, how do you disclose, what are the services, what are the policies and procedures that you would need to follow in terms of being able to receive services. So please make sure that you download that if you're interested. And as well, contact us if you're interested in training and workshops. Okay, thank you.
All right, hi guys. My name is Megan Asadian, and I work with the Rape Recovery Center, and I work in outreach and access as a primary prevention educator. So really quickly, just kind of how I got into this line of work. I'm 22 years old, and I recently graduated from college. I experienced sexual assault on campus, and I also knew a lot of people who experienced sexual assault on campus. So a lot of my experience in college was trying to find spaces where I could find advocates and support and feel safe on campus, right? So here I am right now doing this work. I'm a relatively new hire at the Rape Recovery Center, and I want to go ahead and just talk about what we do as an organization. So we're in Salt Lake City. We're located in the Sugar House area, and we have a team of advocates, therapists, and counselors, and so we do short-term and long-term counseling. And we also have support groups. And so our whole philosophy is working with individuals who have dealt with sexual trauma or assault, and kind of making them feel safe, and then also kind of building them up to find a space of support in the community. But what I specifically do is I work with outreach and access, and so what that looks like is I go out into the community and I talk about different things depending on who my audience is. So I'll give an example. So sometimes we'll go to junior highs and we'll talk about what is a healthy relationship at this age? What is consent? Those kind of basic definitions. Get an idea of what individuals at that age are thinking about. And then we also go to high schools, right? And we also go to colleges as well, so youth and young adult. But then we also talk to other adults in the community and make sure that people are really generating this conversation surrounding consent and sexual assault at large. And then also what we've been focusing on in outreach and access is kind of shifting our curriculum to address individuals in the LGBT community and also in refugee populations, so populations that are a little bit more vulnerable. And so that's kind of in the works right now. Another project that we have right now is building up teen advocacy networks, so kind of having teenagers in the Salt Lake area feeling more empowered to talk about sexual assault and meeting very consistently to have these conversations and kind of see what that looks like in the community. I know that we're running out of time. I just want to open up the floor for questions, what the Rape Recovery Center does, a little bit more about my work, or just questions in general. Yes?
Well, how about for the youth, like with the teens?
Mm-hmm.
And let's say, can children, teenagers get involved that maybe haven't experienced it, but are very aware of it and want to be involved?
Yeah, so is your specific question, how can teenagers get more involved? Yeah, that's a really great question. So I did mention our teen advocacy network. It's more in the works, but really what we're trying to do is focus on just generating more conversations. We go out to high schools a lot, and it's very clear that a lot of teenagers are really willing to have these conversations. It's unfortunately the case that a lot of them are recognizing that it's very normal to hear about sexual assault, but there's also a degree of shame, and nobody's going to believe me. And so it's really nice to see that a lot of individuals are wanting to step up, but really what we're working on right now is also making spaces for people, teenagers, to feel empowered to speak up about what they want to do about this, or maybe even their own experiences. And so that's a really great question, and that's something that's kind of in the works for us right now. Anybody else? Yes.
Question about like individuals qualifying for these services, because I feel, I'm a school teacher, and I feel like unless they have Medicaid or insurance, our kids are in this hard spot where they can't get care they need. So I'm wondering,
Are you talking about in Utah County, or are you talking about?
Utah County specifically, but anywhere, because
Yeah.
you're kind of stuck if you don't have the insurance or you're not,
That's
you know,
a
like.
great question.
Yeah.
For our agency, all of our services are free. And then there's the Children's Justice Center for children, and adults who were sexually assaulted as children. The Children's Justice Center is a great service for them as well. So, and their services are free, and then they also have great resources out in the community that they know of people who can provide services.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to add to that, at the Rape Recovery Center, about 90% of our clients actually don't pay. And we do offer sliding scale as well. So it's very accessible. And I'd also like to add, I forgot to mention that we offer a lot of services in Spanish. So that has actually been really great. Did you want to add something?
Oh, yeah. There's also the crime victim reparation form, which helps to, and that's why a lot of the services are free at the Rape Recovery Center. And so that definitely
And
helps.
getting a
to
code
pay.
R. So
And
if
to
you go
get
to the
a
hospital, we'll fill one of those out and submit that. So hopefully that can be covered.
And it's more than just the medical too, it's
Like dental, anything that
Yeah.
could come, potentially
even
come.
door lock changes and everything like that.
Yep.
Is included in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just one thing that I'd like to add as well, we have a 24-hour crisis line, and it's 365 days a year. And so we have our volunteer and staff operate on that, and we also have a hospital response team of advocates for people who are in a hospital setting. So I suppose that's it, unless anybody has any. Yes, go ahead.
And this is in Utah County, or is this just Salt Lake?
Sin.
So Rape Recovery Center typically focuses on Salt Lake. Center for Women and Children in Crisis is Utah County.
Yeah.
So that's why I
There's a
want to.
24-hour hotline as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what our volunteers do.
Okay.
She's doing it right now.
She's doing it right now. Okay, so really quick as we wrap up, I think it's great to talk about this and to know the statistics and to really understand the issue. But I think you are all here, and we're grateful that you're here because you want to know, and now what, right? And now what do I do with this? So as we wrap up, I just want to talk about a few quick things about how you can help. First and foremost, remember that the only person responsible for sexual assault is the person who perpetrates sexual assault. I think sometimes we forget that, and it can be easy for us to place the blame on victims and say, well, she was wearing this, well, she was drinking this, well, she was doing this. But that makes this conversation, we take a million steps backward from where we've come, and we've got a million steps forward that we still need to go. So remember that. And second, remember and believe that you actually can do something. I think sometimes these issues can seem so overwhelming and so daunting that it's like, what can I as one person do? You absolutely can do something. So let's talk about that. So if someone comes to you and says, I was sexually assaulted, this is, I think, a really great response. Thank you for sharing that with me. Clearly, you are brave and courageous to come forward with this. What can I do to help? Because I think by saying that, that can be really powerful. These are some things as well to keep in mind when it comes to providing support. Sometimes providing support is knowing where to turn that person for resources, whether it's a 24-hour crisis line or one of these organizations. Sometimes it's just listening. So asking that person, what can I do to help you? Because they've come for a reason, and it's probably some sort of help. Maybe they just want you to listen, or maybe they want you to refer them to resources, or go with them to the Center for Women and Children in Crisis or the Rape Recovery Center, or do something like that. So ask them what they need from you. And these are important things to keep in mind. Avoid judgment. Judgment usually comes in asking questions. Well, what were you doing? Well, what were you wearing? In trying to figure out the situation, which I think when those questions are asked, it's typically not with malicious intent. You are just getting this piece of information. You're like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do with this. And so you start asking questions because you want to know more. That can come across very victim blaming because that person's already thought about what they were wearing and what they were doing and what they were drinking. So just keep that in mind. Avoid judgment and try not to ask too many questions. Avoid misinterpreting someone's response or reaction. Trauma affects people differently. Some people might be fine. Someone might be laughing about it. Someone might be crying about it. And by taking those reactions and responding and thinking, well, if you're laughing about this, surely you weren't raped. Surely this wasn't a problem because you're laughing, you're fine. don't misinterpret and recognize that trauma affects everyone in different ways. If someone comes forward, as we said before, they're telling you the truth, and so it's important to keep that in mind. Check in periodically. The impacts of this can be long-lasting. If someone's come to you and disclosed, they obviously feel comfortable with you, and so it's important that, maybe they don't want to talk about it right now, but maybe in a week they do. Maybe in a month they do, and maybe that's when they're ready to start down their path of healing. So checking in with the person periodically, remembering there's no timetable for recovery. Everyone recovers and heals at a different time, and so it's important to know that just because someone hasn't never saying to someone, well, haven't you gotten over it by now? Well, it happened when you were 5 years old. Aren't you over it by now? There is no timetable for recovery. So just letting that person know that you're there and that you support them. And then finally, knowing the resources like Center for Women and Children in Crisis, UCASA, Rape Recovery Center, knowing what resources are out there. So if they do need help, you can get them connected. Few last things. Be willing to stand up. I think that's why you're all here, because you're willing to stand up and make a difference. Most people don't do something for one of 4 reasons. Either they think that it won't do any good, they feel like they'll be retaliated against, they think someone else will do something, or they just don't know what to do. So you are all here tonight, and hopefully we can resolve some of these issues. Being engaged bystander, this is something that we talk a lot about when it comes to prevention and intervening in situations, recognizing that we all have a responsibility for everything that goes on around us, and being engaged and willing to look around and recognize when things just don't feel right. In our office at BYU, we often say all you have to do is care. When it comes to being an engaged bystander, you can create a distraction, you can ask questions, you can refer to an authority, or you can enlist other people to get involved. But there are a lot of ways to get involved. But if you see something that's not right, do one of these things. If it's creating a distraction, we've often found, say you see a couple and they're arguing and you're not sure if it's escalating, going up to them and saying, hey, do you know what time it is? Just kind of interrupts and diffuses it to where maybe something, there could be a different outcome. Create a distraction. Ask questions. If you see someone who's at a party and you're wondering, you see someone talking to them and you feel like maybe they're not comfortable, ask them. Hey, are you comfortable? Hey, can I talk to you for a second and get their perspective? But again, just being engaged as a bystander, paying attention to what's happening around you, and using some of these techniques to do that is really effective. Finally, do something. When it's interesting, because when it comes to being an engaged bystander, there have been studies done that show if there are 4 or more people that witness a traumatic event, the likelihood that someone will intervene is 31%. That's really low, right? You would think more people around, more people intervene. If someone feels they're the only person around and the only person that can help, it goes up to 85%. Isn't that counterintuitive a little bit? But there's this thing, the bystander effect shows that if there's a lot of people around, we diffuse responsibility and we assume someone else will do something. That is not the case. Be willing to be the one who stands up and does something. Uniting as men and women. I'm encouraged to see maybe a few men here tonight. Thank you for being here, because it's important to know that often this is referred to as a women's issue, and women's leadership and activism on this is important, but men's voices need to be involved as well, and they're equally as important, and sometimes, unfortunately, can be a little bit more powerful when it comes to really ending these issues. Also helping men understand, I hear a lot of men say, well, I don't sexually assault women, I'm a good guy, so we're good. Well, that's way too low of a bar for being a good guy, right? Like, I don't sexually assault women, I'm a good guy. Oh, yeah, no, that doesn't just make you a good guy just because you're not sexually assaulting or sexually harassing women. So keep that in mind, helping people understand that it takes more. It takes all of us doing our part and doing a little bit more. And again, recognizing that sexual assault and sexual violence, it's not a women's issue, it's a human issue. I hear, and I had a conversation with my husband the other day, someone was saying, oh, well, what if, that was your daughter, or what if that was your sister? And whenever I hear that, I understand the intent, but it makes me cringe a little bit, because I think, why do we have to say that? Why can't we just say, that's another human that we are on this planet with? Why is that okay, right? So just remembering that this is not a women's issue. The more we refer to it as a women's issue, the more we mitigate 90% of the people who are perpetrating this crime, which is men. And I often say, most perpetrators of sexual violence are men, but most men are not perpetrators of sexual violence. So as men, it's important that they are engaged as well. So to you few men who are here, thank you for being here. I don't think you realize how impactful of a voice you can have in this work. And then finally, because this is the Women in Leadership Project, it's important to recognize that a lot of this work and the good you can do comes by simply being a leader, whether that's a capital L leader because you're in a position of authority, or a lowercase l leader where you are willing to stand up and make a difference. It is important to know that a lot of this is modeled by behavior, and people do what they think is okay based on the people that they're around. So if you're willing to stand up and say, I am not okay with this, you're being a leader and you're really going to make a difference. Challenge people. If you hear someone say a sexist joke, or if they're joking, I often, not often, thankfully, but every now and again, I'll hear someone talking about maybe a video game or something, and they'll be like, oh, I totally raped it on that video game. And I am not afraid to tell that person that is not okay to say. If you hear comments like that, if you hear things coming up where you can challenge that, or if someone says, well, it was her fault, she went to the party, or she went out with him, she went up the canyon with him alone, what was she expecting? Challenge that, be willing to say something, and use this workshop as an example. Hey, I was in a workshop last night, and this is what we talked about, and let's have a conversation about that, because I don't think that's exactly what happened, and every time we blame the victim, it takes the onus of the issue off the perpetrator, and he's the only one responsible for that. Again, using gender normative terms, but it's just important to know that you can challenge things, and hopefully you feel more empowered here tonight after the information you've received to be able to do that. And then finally, I think also taking accountability for our own actions and what we're doing, because unfortunately, I think a lot of these things are perpetuated and we don't even realize it. Maybe we're the one making a comment, or maybe by saying something, we're perpetuating this idea of either victim blaming or shaming or whatever it might be. So modeling accountability through leadership and being willing to look at ourselves in our own circles, maybe behaviors we've put up with or been okay with. Those are all ways that we can be leaders in this movement. Again, whether it's positional leadership like maybe the four of us hold, or just leadership in your own circles with your own friends in your own communities, saying sexual violence is not okay. Sexual assault in the state of Utah is a problem, and we have to be willing to do something about it. So my big thing, I always say, act, just act. Action changes things, and it absolutely does. You are all here tonight for a reason. As Nubia mentioned, you could have chosen any of the other breakouts to go to, and I'm sure they were all fabulous. There was a few that I was like, oh, I wish I wasn't presenting, because I would go to those. They were awesome topics, but we appreciate you being here tonight. There's a reason for it. You've been given this information now. We hope that you know that you individually can make a difference. It's all of us working together, all of us using our voices to allow other people to use their voices as well. And that's when we're really going to impact sexual assault in Utah and bring those numbers down. So here is information for all of us who were speaking tonight. I realize we're about out of time. If anyone has questions, I invite you to come connect with us after. I think the four of us would be happy to talk to any of you, connect you to resources if you need. We have some handouts and things up here. But thank you all for being here, and just know that we're all grateful that you're here, and we know that you can each make a difference in the lives of the people that you care about. So with that, thank you.
Just a quick thank you to Tiffany and all of our presenters tonight, and thank you to all of you for coming.